Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. I'm going to continue our series on idolatry, and today I'm going to read from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5 verses 38 to 47. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbour and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Excuse me. Well, thus far in this series of signposts, we've considered some gods of the ancient world that we might not immediately think of being as worshipped in our enlightened modern society. But that's not so much the case with the one we're going to look at today, the Roman god Mars, the god of war. For violence is everywhere, all around us. In Roman mythology, Mars was one of the most important gods of the empire. In fact, he was thought to be the father of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, who were conceived through Mars's rape of Rhea Silvia. Given that the empire was literally birthed from such horrific violence, it was Mars more than any of the other ancient Roman gods who shaped the ethos and the culture of the city and its empire, one of the most brutal empires the world has ever known. For the Romans, Mars represented military power as a means of securing peace, hence the Latin phrase qui desiderat pacem preparat bellum, which translates as let him who desires peace prepare for war. Whilst the Latin phrase may be largely unfamiliar today unless you're a John Wick fan, nonetheless the ethos that it espouses underpins much of modern society, from politics to the business world and interpersonal relationships. Our response to yet another mass school shooting in America one response to yet another mass school shooting in America was to suggest that teachers should be armed and given appropriate training, because the best way to combat bad guys with guns was to have more good guys with guns. There's a proverbial saying that you must fight fire with fire, but in the real world, fighting fire with water works best. The Geneva Academy currently lists 114 armed ongoing conflicts around the world, few of which are ever reported in our news media. But, there is always a war on the news. We've become very familiar with the horror of the bombing of hospitals and refugee camps in Gaza and the grinding war of attrition in Ukraine, situations in which Mars is clearly being worshipped. However, as we will hopefully see, he is also being worshipped in a variety of less obvious ways right under our noses. It's everywhere and all around us, often labelled as entertainment. Lee Child is famous for writing the hugely popular international best-selling books. I think there's about 29 of them now. In those books, the main character, Jack Reacher, is a good guy, a hero who defends the weak and the helpless, and who always gets the girl. Despite being a couple of feet and a few muscles short of Reacher, Tom Cruise has starred in 2 Reacher movies, and Amazon Prime have also made 3 series of dramas based on the stories, as well as another series coming out, I think. Reacher may be the hero, But from a different perspective, he is a violent vigilante who makes sure that the bad guys get what is coming to them as painfully as possible. And his motto is, get your retaliation in first. Violence is everywhere on our TV and cinema screens. For example, the extremely violent John Wick franchise is massively popular and has already led to at least one blockbuster spin-off movie and a TV series on Amazon Prime, the Continental. In the most recent John Wick movie, he killed 140 people in gory detail. And he's the hero. And fans can't get enough with a fifth installment in the franchise already confirmed. We have been conditioned through all of this to think that violence is not just unavoidable, but that it is a necessary way to solve problems. I recently heard a parent say that they told their child that if another child hit them, they should hit them back, only harder. In the United States of America, a country awash with guns, school shootings and gun violence are commonplace. In fact, 47,000 people were killed in gun violence in 2024. We don't have figures for this year yet, and we won't have till the end of the year, but there's already been over 300 mass shootings from January till August. The Second Amendment of the US Constitution upholds the right of citizens to bear arms. Of course, it was written when that meant single-shot muskets, not an AR-15 assault rifle. Here in the UK, where guns are much more difficult to come by, violence using knives is much more common. When our political leaders are challenged in the media about violence, they often speak of working for peace or we're tackling knife crime. But the idolatry of violence is embedded into our cultural consciousness, and so peace is as elusive as ever. With Russian incursions into NATO airspace, we are perhaps closer to nuclear conflict than at any time since the end of the Cold War. And we rationalise violence as an unwelcome reality, an unavoidable aspect of living in a fallen and sinful world. Bible scholar Tom Wright has noted violence is glorified in films, in computer games and novels, and acted out on the streets and in homes. Where we once had a society where everybody at least gave lip service to the principle that forgiveness was a good thing, we are now moving rapidly towards the state where it is seen as a sign of weakness. Hitting back is the norm. Mars rules, and the sacrifices that are offered at his shrine are usually human ones. If Christians are to confront the idolatry of violence, we have to begin by acknowledging that the church has much to repent of in this regard. For 1700 years, the church has supported the state in its wars through its worship, liturgy, prayers and services, endorsing war and violence. The church has led crusades in a brutal war against Islam for control of the Holy Land, killing hundreds of thousands of men, women and children just because they were Muslims. During the Reformation, both Catholic and Protestant Christians tortured and killed one another in the name of God. And still today, their legacy of sectarianism stubbornly continues. The support of the church provided Western governments with a sense of divine approval to bomb Iraq and Syria and Libya and Afghanistan or wherever, all underwritten by the notion that God is on our side because our cause is just. It was St. Augustine who came up with the idea of the just war, the view that has been widely accepted within most mainline Christian denominations in the West. But Augustine didn't develop his theory from a careful study of the scriptures or looking at the life and teaching of Jesus. Rather, it was from a careful study of the philosophy of Aristotle and Plato. Basically, the theory states that war must be declared for a just cause, although who decides what's just, that's an issue. War must be fought with a good intention. There must be a reasonable expectation that more good than evil will be the result. War must be waged by proportionate means, in other words, avoiding civilian casualties. War must be the last resort after exhausting other options. War must be declared and fought by a legitimate authority. I don't think you'd have to look very hard to see that most of the wars that are being fought in the world today don't match any of those criteria. But before St. Augustine's theory of the just war, and with only a few regional variations, most Christians in the first centuries of the Church understood non-violence to be an essential aspect of being a disciple of Jesus. Theologians of this period were unanimous in their writings that Christians should not participate in war. This was reinforced in church disciplinary regulations that stated that anyone who joined the army after becoming a Christian should be excommunicated from the church. Similarly, any soldier who converted was to be excommunicated if they took a life. In 170 AD, Roman law therefore banned Christians from joining the army because they wouldn't fight. But by 401 AD, it was against the law for anyone who was not a Christian to join the army. The Church's support for the empire and its wars, again, wasn't the result of careful study of Scripture or the life and teachings of Jesus, but the pragmatism of wanting to gain the favour and goodwill of the emperor and so bring to an end the persecution of Christians across the empire. Through the Church's participation in war, the cross, which had been understood to be a symbol of self-sacrifice and love, became a rallying point for armies shedding the blood of others. As Christians, our primary allegiance is not to the state or the king or to a political party. It is to Jesus, the King of Kings. The Greek word in the New Testament translated as faith or belief is pistis, and it means allegiance, loyalty, and fidelity. Therefore, our response to violence and war should not be determined by political allegiances, patriotism, or a cultural glorification of violence, but by the life and teaching and commands of Jesus, our King. Most scholars agree that the Sermon on the Mount contains the essence of Jesus' response to the violence of his first century world. A world that, although technologically less advanced than ours, was in many respects even more brutally violent. In summary, we can say that he forbade retaliation against those who do evil. He also commanded his disciples to love their enemies, and remember, love is a verb. It is always expressed in loving actions. And he commanded them to pray for their persecutors. In responding this way, they would reflect God's own nature. In Matthew 25 verse 52, Jesus explicitly forbade the use of the sword, which we would understand in our contemporary context as being any weapon of war, including an AR-15. In John 18 verse 36, he said that in contrast to the world, whose hallmark is violence, the hallmark of his kingdom is non-violence. Perhaps reflecting this, the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10 verse 4, the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. A common phrase in our culture is that the end justifies the means. But Jesus completely rejected coercion and violence as a means of achieving any good thing or anything related to the kingdom of God. Now, it's easy to dismiss or reinterpret Jesus' teaching about violence on the basis, that it's a kind of unrealistic wishful thinking. But actually, he was fully aware of the violent brutality of the world around him. He knew how countercultural, how against the grain of human reasoning that it was. And the thing is, really the clincher is that Jesus did not just teach the non-violent resistance of evil. He embodied it in his words and actions. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus confronted the forces of evil on almost every page, setting people free from demonic oppression. In fact, throughout the Gospels we see Jesus confronting and resisting evil in all its forms, yet he does so without committing violence, even when he is threatened with violence or violence is done to him. So the command not to retaliate but to love your enemies is not a command to passive acceptance. Jesus does not say do not resist evil, but rather do not resist an evil person. The issue, therefore, is not whether evil should be resisted, but rather how it should be resisted. Another way of dismissing Jesus' teaching is to suggest that he was able to do this because he was God in the flesh, whereas we are only human. But other humans have put his teaching into practice. For example, it was reflecting on Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount that led Dr. Martin Luther King to say, hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate. Violence multiplies violence. Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. We never get rid of an enemy by meeting hate with hate. We get rid of an enemy by getting rid of enmity. Jesus' teaching and example of non-violent resistance was the foundation of the non-violent resistance of the civil rights movement led by Dr. King. They suffered being beaten and being falsely imprisoned. They were treated unjustly and harshly, and some were killed, but they did not fight back. Rather, they demonstrated the self-giving, reconciling love of Christ their King. One could also mention Gandhi in a similar way, for it was Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount that inspired him to practice the non-violent resistance of evil. We must resist evil, but not by evil means. And Jesus leaves us in no doubt that violence is an evil means. Glenn Stassen suggests that the word translated here as resist usually means not to engage in revengeful or violent retaliation. The fact is that when we retaliate, it is usually fundamentally about asserting our own rights over an individual or situation. When we retaliate, we are declaring that we did not deserve to be treated in a particular way, that it is a violation of our rights that we now feel compelled to address. Jesus expects his followers to behave differently. As Bonhoeffer says of this text, followers of Jesus who experience injustice do not cling to their own rights as if they were possessions to be defended at all costs. Instead, they are completely free of such possessions and are bound to Jesus Christ alone. Jesus tells us here that it is in loving our enemies and praying for our persecutors that we will be children of the Father, that it reveals what it means to be children of the Father. As Ron Sider has put it, one fundamental aspect of the holiness and perfection of God is that he loves his enemies. Those who by grace seek to reflect his holiness will likewise love their enemies, even when it involves a cross. Jesus didn't use force to combat force. Rather, it was through the self-giving, suffering love of the cross that he defeated evil and brought about reconciliation. And furthermore, as Paul tells us in Corinthians, God has given us that same ministry of reconciliation. Whatever situation we are faced with in life, even if it's on the receiving end of violence, even violence that leads to martyrdom, as disciples of Jesus, we must understand that we are not ministers of God's wrath, but ministers of God's reconciling love. Following his example, we as faithful disciples of Jesus are also called to conquer through patient endurance, even unto death. And you might be tempted to think, well, I haven't punched anyone in the face recently, so none of this really applies to me. I'm not worshipping Mars. But Jesus is not simply concerned with our outward actions. At several points in the Sermon on the Mount, he goes deeper into the intentions and motivations of our hearts. For like all idolatries, this one begins in the heart. Anger or hatred for someone festers in the heart. It leads to ill will against them and vile thoughts about them. And left unchecked, those evil thoughts grow into words, malicious gossip that assassinates a person's character. It may never come to physical blows, but violence always begins in the heart. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote that the goal of evil is to reproduce, to increase by eliciting an evil response from the person who's been wronged. But evil becomes powerless when it is not opposed, but is willingly borne and suffered. What the state and the wider society wants us to think, in fact what it has conditioned us to think, is that the approach to violence commanded by Jesus is impossible to live out in practice. And yet Jesus lived it out. When they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. In the same way, when he was on the cross, the thief shouted abuse at him. He remained silent. And even having been nailed to the cross, beaten, spat on, mocked and reviled, his response was, "Father, forgive them." If we would be his followers, should we do any less? Thanks for listening.